Okay, once said that, let's give the floor to Christina Lunz. The stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Selina. Such a pleasure to be here and also to be kind of on the panel with Deborah and Tony. Such an honor. Thank you for allowing me to shift a little bit my part in the discussion, because indeed today is a wonderfully packed day. And I'll have to jump onto a talk show in a second because, as you mentioned, the German Foreign Office presented their feminist foreign policy strategy to the public today in Germany. And at the same time, the Development Ministry also published their feminist strategy. So it's a nothing less than a historic day for feminist politics in Germany today, and also an important day for German government policies. So in my little input, I'll give a short overview, what I believe are the key aspects of feminist foreign policy, where it's coming from, and a short assessment of the strategy here in Germany. So feminist foreign policy as a concept is not new, and those who have been engaged in the feminist movement, they're very well aware that it's at least 100 years old, maybe even older. But we have a big problem in history and in kind of the way history is written down, history of humankind is written down in our society, as in that only 0.5% of 3,500 years of written down history of humankind is about women. And then those women who are even like talked about in history books, they're then again a certain group of a certain class of a certain race. So most history of what women, also feminists, have been doing, and we don't know. But we do know that in 1915, during the First World War in The Hague, 1,200 feminists came together to demand nothing less than the end of the First World War, but also they presented 20 resolutions for a new global order. It included the dismantling of the military-industrial complex. It included peace education, the democratization of foreign policy. It included an arbitration system and mediation as a key tool for conflict resolution. So over the years, the feminists and the feminist movement, who has been working on rethinking global politics, foreign and security policy, they've put a huge focus on demilitarization and disarmament. And that makes sense because feminist foreign policy, feminism as a movement or a collection of movements, is about upending patriarchal structures. It has always been. And patriarchal structures are violent structures in society. So the fact, for example, that almost every woman is affected by male violence, that we have these hierarchies in societies from white men from the global north, mainly, not only, towards other groups of society, towards women, but also towards racialized people, the queer community, disabled people, and hierarchies. These hierarchies that we have had over the past 4,000 to 6,000 years in patriarchal societies, they are kept in place by violence. And violence is most easily exerted with weapons and militarization. So feminism in foreign and security policy focuses on human security instead of militarized security and economic interests. So the feminist movement over the decades, working on feminist foreign policies, on demilitarization, it's been fairly successful. One example is the introduction of a resolution in the UN Security Council in 2000. It's the resolution 1325 on women, peace and security. But that's only one example. And over the past few years, starting in 2014 with Sweden, more and more states have announced a feminist foreign policy. By now, it's 11 states that officially have announced a feminist foreign, a feminist international assistance policy. And today with Germany, we have another country that has officially presented the strategy. So my organization, the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy, and with my organization, we have incredible women on our advisory board, one of them being Tony Hastrup. So lovely to see you here again. we've been involved in the developing of the German feminist foreign policy strategy, and as a assessment of what was presented today, it is fantastic. It is really fantastic. I mean, so the question in interviews today that I've had to respond to is like, what is my assessment of the strategy? And it depends on what you compare it with, right? If you compare the strategy and what the foreign minister's Annalena Baerbock's office is trying to do now, if you compare it to governments around the world, it is brilliant. It is absolutely brilliant. It is, I mean, there are only 11 countries that have a feminist foreign policy, and of those, this strategy is really one of the most progressive ones. But if you compare it to what feminists demand and human rights defenders around the world, there's so much left to realize. So it is definitely, it's a day to celebrate, and it's a day for so many feminists and movers and shakers and human rights defenders around the world to celebrate today. And from tomorrow, we'll get back to work to push for even more. Because, you know, one of the biggest things, on the panel with the minister, I was asked about budgets and money and financial resources. We need to be aware of the fact that the world that has been created internationally is one which is hyper militarized. So in 2021, that was the second year of the pandemic, the highest ever recorded annual spending on defense happened. So in 2021, for the first time ever, more than $2 trillion were spent on militarization and defense. In the very same year, the UN approved a budget of $6.5 billion for UN peacekeeping. That is less than 0.4% of the budget or the annual spending on militarization. So in this world that we live, that prioritizes military and destruction, exploitation over human security, can never be a safe world for anyone. So feminist foreign policy really tries, ideally with all tools that it has, to dismantle patriarchal structures, to eradicate discrimination, so that ultimately at some point, hopefully all of us can live in a world that is safe and stable and secure for everyone. Merci.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Christina Lunz, for providing us with this great and fruitful introduction that touched upon a lot of points we will definitely get deeper into later on. And it will surely be useful for our upcoming discussion. Thank you so much for making time for us in these busy times, and all the best also for the next meetings, for the media marathon and all the upcoming events. Thank you so much, and we hope to see you soon again. Okay, so with this said, let's continue. Now, before I will introduce our panelists, it's time to shine for all of you. We would like to get to know our audience a little bit more. So please rank your experience in FFP from 1 to 5 in our little survey that should pop up on your screen right now. So 1 would mean that you don't have any clue what feminist foreign policy actually means and why we're gathering here and what we talk about when we talk about feminism as a political agenda. And 5 would mean that you could consider yourself an expert in the field. In the second question, you're being asked about the most important aspect of FFP for you. Of course, it's also not an easy choice. There's no right or wrong. And although there might be even more points that sound important to you, please select only one. And in the last question and the third question, you can answer on how you would define security. I can see there are more and more answers coming in. Okay, I would say that most people have already answered. Let's give it another second. I can see the very interesting results already. Okay, great. I think it's almost everyone. Paula, would you provide us with a comment on the results?
Hi, can you hear me? All right, thank you so much. Yes, it will be my pleasure. So we have an audience, I would say almost 50% of them answered that they are in between not experts and experts. So that's great. We have a lot of people already knowing a bit. And I'm also glad to know that there is people joining who don't have any experience. So we really hope to give you good insight on the topic. And we have a 1% or like 15% of people that it's really, really expert. I'm also very glad to have those people in the meeting. Then regarding the most important aspect of feminist foreign policy, there is a 33% of people mentioning human security. That's interesting, and that's also defined in the definitions we provided that I will very soon post again for those that joined a bit later. But the concept of human security as opposed to national security, we will touch upon that as well. And there's also equality for all, and then followed by women's rights and human rights and sustainable crisis management. And finally, regarding the definition of security, we have a majority talking about intersectional justice. That's great, since we will also touch upon intersectional topics. Then we have human rights for all, and it's followed by peace and unity. Just 1% answered the absence of war. And that's great to see. We hope when you leave the meeting, you can understand all of the points that we put here and that you know why we put them. So now I will finish the poll and give you the floor, Selina, again.
Thank you very much for being so kind to share all the results with us. Yeah, if you wonder what's happening here, I have some technical issues with the light, but I hope you cannot see me now. Okay, let's continue. So as we heard already, earlier today, the German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock and the Foreign Office released the guidelines for the implementation on their FFP that was agreed upon in the coalition agreement after the last election in 2021. And also Spain, which has decided to pursue an FFP in the same year as Germany, has also recently taken important steps in implementing its FFP in their domestic policies, while France is yet to publish a handbook on feminist diplomacy. But what does all this imply for us and for the EU? That is something we're going to explore tonight. We are going to talk about the multifaceted layers of different approaches to security and the potential impact of FFPs in the EU. Just a few weeks after the security conference in Munich, we want to continue in this format to discuss and inspect the future of feminism as a political agenda, considering also the different definitions, the contexts, and post-colonial or cis-heteronormative tendencies. Our distinguished panelists are all experts in the field, and I'm very sure that they're going to enrich us with their wealth of knowledge on the subject. So let me introduce them quickly before we get started with the discussion. Deborah Rouache is the co-founder and co-director of the Gender in Geopolitics Institute in France, which places gender at the heart of the analysis of international relations. Leading the research department of her think tank, she specializes in women's rights in Iran the instrumentalization of gender in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and feminist foreign policy and the place of women in conflict and post-conflict. Thank you for being here with us. Ines Arco Escriche is a research fellow at the Barcelona Center for International Affairs, where she focuses on analyzing the emergence of feminist foreign policy and pro-gender rules in the international system. Her current research covers the influence of domestic issues on Chinese foreign policy, EU-China and Taiwan relations, and East Asia regional dynamics. Also, thank you to you for being here with us. And Tony Hastrup is a professor in international politics at the University of Stirling. Her research broadly explores the nature of global power hierarchies between the global north and south in knowledge and in practice. She has worked on the global governance of security via regional security institutions like the African and European Union. A part of her current research agenda draws on critical feminisms to understand contemporary foreign policy practices. Also, thank you, a pleasure for having you with us tonight. And Christina Lunz, who already had to rush to her next meeting, is the co-founder and co-CEO at the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy and has expertise in psychology, global governance, and ethics. She has co-initiated various activist campaigns and received several awards in fellowships from renowned institutions, and she's also the author of the best-selling book, The Future of Foreign Policy is Feminist. That was published 1 year ago in German, but I'm very confident it will soon be available in English as well. Okay, finally, without further ado, let's get started with our panel discussion and see what our panelists have to say. First, about the different interpretations of FFP in our first round of introduction. So, for the introductory round, I would like to start with you, Ines. I mentioned briefly already in the introduction that Spain recently took some steps in implementing FFP. Could you please tell us a short description of what FFP means from the Spanish angle in 3 core aspects, as well as the current state of implementation? That would be wonderful.
Thank you so much, Selina. First of all, I want to thank you for the invitation, and also I want to apologize because my voice is a little bit not at her best today, but I'll do my best. I want to start by using a little bit the official discourse of Spain in feminist foreign policy. So what they usually say is that feminist foreign policy is a hallmark of Spain's identity in the international arena. And this means that they put gender equality and women's empowerment as a distinctive element of Spain's foreign policy, with the objective to contribute to achieve real gender equality in international arena. And this is the official discourse. But to be sure, I would say that the Spain feminist foreign policy is not really that new. If we go into their guide, all that they are presenting, it's mainly based on previous commitments and projects already in development. So, for example, in 2014, Spain already adopted a law that established that the promotion of women's rights and gender equality was a priority in their international development projects. And for example, also in the implementation of the Agenda 2030, some of the priorities for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, it's to eradicate gender-based violence, to promote sexual and reproductive rights, or end the discrimination of women around the world. So we can say that this is actually something that is already built on previous commitments. And what the government normally tries to show is that those principles have to be applied in a transversal way, which is really similar to what we know as gender mainstreaming, that there has to be leadership by the ministry, normally related to resource. And I think that it's important what Christina said, because Spain has not done any type of commitment to a real budget towards implementing a feminist foreign policy. Also, the build of alliances with like-minded countries to promote gender rights and women's rights in international fora, and intersectionality. And I think that this is an interesting point, because even if it's something that the government of Spain is actively promoting, there are some type of inconsistencies. For example, when I started using the definition, the official definition, it was something that I wanted to point out, that they are talking about woman and not gender. I mean, there's an equivalence between gender and woman that does not really show all the complicated picture about gender relations and domination. And at the same time, even the Spanish external policies, priorities, they do a separation between promoting feminist foreign policy and promoting LGBT rights and anti-racism. So I think that it's interesting that even if we have this guide, there is some separation and even disagreements on how it's really a feminist foreign policy in Spain that go, I mean, the definition is really feminist is women's rights. And I think that this is a clear limitation of the current approach. And regarding implementation, okay, so in 9 days, it's going to be the second birthday since the guide was presented and the policy was adopted. And we have seen no monitoring reports. We have seen no commitment again. There was a huge bump when the policy was presented. But after the destitution of the former Foreign Affairs Minister Arantxa González Laya in the beginning of the war of Ukraine, it seems that feminist foreign policy has completely left the discourse on how is Spain feminist foreign policy going to be.
Thank you very much. I think that is a very good overview already, which leads me directly to ask you, Deborah. What about you? What does the French, or not only you personally, but also the French interpretation of FFP look like in the 3 core aspects? And in what respects do you think does it differ from the Spanish interpretation? And also here, what is the current state of implementation?
Thank you, Selena, for the question, for the invitation to this panel. So for what has just been said by Ines, I think one of the major similar elements is the human rights aspect, as French identity is built on this value. So it is as well a core value and a core aspect in the French feminist foreign policy. But there is a first difference is that France has not yet published, as you said earlier, an handbook on the feminist foreign policy since 2019, when France claimed its foreign policy to be feminist. So there is no official definition, but we can understand its orientations based on the last international strategy for gender equality published in 2018. And just to clarify, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is currently drafting both the last international strategy for gender equality review and a new strategy, which will include the definition of the feminist foreign policy. And there is also the third national action plan for the Women, Peace and Security Agenda published by France that gives us also guidelines for the French FFPs. So about the orientations, French FFPs aims to improve the situation of women in the world, to guarantee their rights, especially their sexual and reproductive health and rights, to end violence against women, to guarantee gender mainstreaming in all aspects of French foreign policy, to fund international projects for gender equality through official development assistance, with a focus on the specific needs and experiences of women and girls. And finally, to support feminist NGOs and include them, as well as young people in projects and decision-making. The current FFP claims to be evolving pragmatic and exhaustive. We will see if it's really the case, and to give maybe a distinction between French and Spanish FFP is the priority regions, as French focuses more on the African continent, whereas Spain focuses more on Latin America and the Caribbean, for example. French FFPs focuses largely on fundings. So the government adopted the programming law on solidarity development and the fight against global inequalities 2 years ago. And it defined the goal of the official development assistance devoted to gender equalities, with the goal to reach 75% for this topic in 2025. And in 2021, France allocated 50% of its bilateral aid to projects with main and or significant goal is gender equality. Another key element for French FFP is to help feminist organizations around the world. And in 2020, France launched the Support Fund for feminist organization with a 120 million euro budget to help women's rights movement in the world. And this represents an emblematic tool of French FFPs, and it was renewed at the end of last year. One of the most important topics regarding women's rights for the French FFP are sexual and reproductive health and rights, and considerable diplomatic efforts, but also funding towards this issue are made. France has provided, for example, 400 million euros to support SRHR during the Generation Equality Forum, and it was disbursed earlier last year. Added to this, 50 million euros is committed to the French Muskoka Fund. And the last core aspect of French FFP, I would say it's the political advocacy in multilateral and regional institutions to promote and defend women's rights and human rights, for example, during the Biarritz 2019 partnership, but also during the French presidency of the European Council and the Generation Equality Forum, which is a perfect example because France has to work to convince each country to participate, and there were 90 countries at the end. So it shows that diplomacy is a strong political advocacy tool to build a positive counterpower to the rise of conservatism in the world, and the importance as well to work with different sectors, such as the public and private sector, but also human rights defenders and civil societies to reach gender equality.
Thank you very much, Deborah. I think that's also very interesting to see parallels and also the differences. Now, getting to you, Tony. You have been researching a lot also on the relationship between the EU and the African Union. Could you please describe in 3 core aspects the connection between the feminist critique and the current state of global hierarchies, especially also with the present countries and the interpretations that were just presented to us? That would be very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Selena, for having me here. And it's a pleasure to be on the same panel with Ines and Deborah. Perhaps a good place to start with is, obviously, as you said, I really focus on the European Union, and often the European Union's foreign policy gets treated separately from member states. I'm one person who's often advocated for looking at them separately, but also looking at them together, because regardless of the fact that each member state has its own distinct foreign policy, externally, the European Union represents its member states as well. So I think we need to look at that on the whole. And the first thing to, I guess, underscore is, of course, the European Union itself doesn't have a feminist foreign policy, even though there are lots of discourses around that. When I sort of look at the area that I tend to focus on, which is, of course, Africa, I think a lot of that has been covered by Deborah. The fact that you have countries like France that tend to focus in their, shall we say, traditional spheres of influence, and Spain might focus more on the Caribbean and Latin America. But of course, I think it's really important not to whitewash this, that, you know, the reason why these spaces are traditional spheres of influence is because they're colonized spaces. Today, I think if you've read the latest, I guess, articulation of France's relationship with Africa, President Macron said that he wants to reduce the military presence of France in Africa, and call me a cynic, but I laughed because I recall very, very clearly President Chirac making the exact same statement. I also recall very, very clearly President Sarkozy making the same statement, but not only President Sarkozy, very, very clearly his successor also making the same statement right before the subsequent intervention in Mali. So, as I said, call me a cynic. I don't know what this is going to look like. We've seen the same sort of summits over and over again. So, you know, what does this all mean in the context of feminist foreign policy? I previously critiqued the ability of, say, France, for example, to actually really enact a feminist foreign policy, partly because it's not been willing. So it's one thing to talk about wanting to remove the military from Africa, but it's not been willing to give up its position within the architecture of the current international system, which I've argued is deeply hierarchical. Now, hierarchies are antithetical to emancipatory feminisms. So if feminism is more than just about gender equality, which of course France as well as Spain, as well as Germany is very good in terms of programming, then it has to be concerned with upending other sources of structural inequality, including racism, ableism, transphobia, and indeed capitalism, at least in its most destructive aspects. So I would say this is the first point. Most of those countries that we've mentioned that practice feminist foreign policy, at least on the face of it, even if they hope to progress to something better at a later date, are not really willing to interrogate their position within the structure of the international system itself. That doesn't mean, of course, that they aren't incorporating certain feminist principles. And we certainly see this in France, being, as Deborah said, one of the co-sponsors of Generation Equality. And I think that this is a really important moment. We also see that in a lot of the work that Germany has done lately, as well as Spain. So in the Declaration of Feminist Foreign Policy itself, a lot of European member states are at least paying attention to the fact that, well, some of these things have to be challenged. Of course, their willingness to do so, I think, is something else. The relationship between African countries, African institutions, as well as the European Union, and here I mean both the institutions as well as the member states, has always been hierarchical, precisely because of the relationship that underscores it, which is coloniality. And often we couch this in terms like it's an asymmetrical relationship. Now, we've been talking about the EU's asymmetry with African countries since 1957. The heart of coloniality and the unwillingness to sort of unpick and actually admit that this is still a structure of the relationship, I think is one of the impediments to, for me, a true fulfillment of any sort of feminist foreign policy or feminist aspiration. So I guess the big question then, as a second point is, you know, to what extent does the adoption or the understanding of feminisms that has been adopted by a lot of the states that are engaged in Africa, to what extent is it willing to actually interrogate the impact of colonialism? Now, one of the things that I would say Germany, since today Germany has introduced its guidelines and a few weeks ago also introduced the Africa strategy, has tried to do is actually acknowledge that the colonial continuities, discrimination, and racism is part of what feminist foreign policy should be seeking to upend. And I think third, when we look at the current state of affairs, which sort of allows the European Union, including its member states, to be ontologically secure, which is to have a security and sense of self. And here I'm arguing that precisely this unequal relationship that we find still problematic is what allows the European Union to feel secure in itself, which then means that any attempt to challenge this often makes the European Union feel insecure. A true implementation of feminism and feminist foreign policy, of course, will then therefore challenge the ontological security of the European Union. But we see that a lot of African states, as well as African institutions, have been trying to do this, as I said, for over 60 years and haven't really gotten anywhere. If anything, often attempts by the European Union institution, as well as in some cases, member states, I've already talked about France, tends to reinscribe the subordination of Africans as well as African institutions and structures. So where we sort of see a fight back or a pushback against European Union practices, we also see a doubling down so far on the part of the European Union. So I think as a sort of a third dimension, that in order for feminist foreign policy to really progress, in order for feminist foreign policy to mean anything for the recipients of those policies, we really need to see the European Union, inclusive of its member states, really interrogate its own place in the world and really commit to breaking down those global hierarchies within the broader international system.
Thank you very much. I think there were a lot of different and very important points in this statement already, which leads me to the next round of questions. So in the understanding of feminist foreign policy, as from the countries we heard the definition from already, it says that to achieve peace worldwide, it seems more sustainable to act feminist globally. Which is why more and more countries are actually adopting feminist foreign policies. However, the patriarchy's definition of security, also in feminist foreign policies addressed, is heavily linked to masculinity and militarization, which by definition excludes at least 50% of the population already. And FFP is related to putting everyone's human rights at the center. So, Deborah, how does France emphasize the human rights of all in its approach to feminist diplomacy? Also with the comment from Tony Hastrup. Can you tell us more about how French diplomacy thinks about its actions abroad?
Yes, thank you for this question. What Tony just said is very important. And yes, I think France has difficulty to go out its way and to think a new relationship with the African continent. So about how the French government think about all human rights, I think there is some elements that are lacking because, of course, the FFP of France does not aim to set aside certain people, but to defend the human rights of everyone. However, sometimes not naming specifically certain groups has the effect of making them invisible. And in the international strategy for gender equality, there is no mention of LGBT plus people, non-Western women, or even a person with disabilities. So it is important for France to appeal to the concept of intersectionality in order to take into account the realities of a diversity of people who can suffer from discrimination based on their sexual orientation, their skin color, their religion, their ethnicity, etc. And for now, French feminist foreign policy lacks a systematic intersectional approach in its actions. the feminism defended by France has biases. Its conception is Eurocentric, heteronormative, and liberal. And we know that the perspective of Western women who experience discriminations is not universal. So it is essential to be aware of it when applying a feminist foreign policy. And it is an evolving position in the French government. I can talk about that further after. And to answer your second question, so French diplomacy conceives its action abroad mainly through ODA, so with fundings and the implementation of the development program to tackle inequalities and defend women's rights. And the importance of ODA in the French FFPs question the relations with the countries, with the populations and the countries who received this assistance. And due to its past and its relationship to the African continent, France must pay particular attention to the discourse and the programs carried out with local population to not reproduce a relationship of domination and power relations, and it is the same for its involvement in conflict mediation. Moreover, the French foreign policy is pragmatic and realistic, which means its feminist foreign policy is not holistic. For example, defense and trade policies are not included. The global arms market is booming, and France is a major contributor as it is the world's third largest arms exporter. And France continues to sell arms to countries that violate women's rights, such as Egypt and Saudi Arabia. And as we know, militarizations increases violence against women. And this realistic and progressive approach is also found for the nuclear disarmament, explaining the non-ratification by France of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So this situation creates double standards that exacerbate contradictions between official speeches and concrete actions. And I think French FFP will gain legitimacy by adopting an automatic feminist approach, an intersectional approach in all areas, and by rethinking its FFP to consider it a tool to bring structural changes and address the root of gender inequalities around the world.
Okay, great. In response to that, Tony, as a critical feminist, what do you think? You have mentioned global hierarchies also regarding the relationship between the EU and the African Union. What do you think? How is it also linked, like masculinities, in this context, also shaping militarization and the understanding of security?
Thank you, Selena. So I think one of the things to perhaps think about, I'll use the example of the European Union, right? So for a long time, the EU was either considered to not be a security actor or a weak security actor. And over many years, what we then decided on is that in order for the EU to really be a good security actor, what it needs is strategic autonomy, which tells us that this particular understanding of security is very much locked into the EU's military capabilities. This is despite the fact that actually EU member states, some of them, a lot of them are already members of NATO. This is despite the fact that individual member states have their own military capabilities. There's still this idea that because the EU doesn't have its own military capabilities, then it's not really a security actor. So we've got these tools, but the EU needs its own. So what happens when we finally get to the point where potentially the EU has these tools? Well, I guess the big question for me is always, who is militarization exercised on? So far, what we've seen from the European Union is to help preserve and govern casserole borders under the guise of caring. They articulate ideas of human security, but one that is militarized and therefore exclusionary. What we see then is we see a lot of EU commitments to training, particularly in places like Africa, that reinforce colonial racisms, where the EU is then positioned as being a security actor, a muscular security actor, because it is leaning on militarism. And I think here it's important to perhaps distinguish between militarism and militarization. For as long as we've known, and I guess for good or for bad, most states within the international system, almost all 200 of them, they kind of want their own militaries. It's very rare that a state does not have its own independent military, even though we do have some of that. When they don't, they align with some other states that has its own military. A lot of these militaries are only used for defensive reasons. So in that sense, okay, we have an international system that kind of aligns some sort of militarization, so having the tools, the weapons as part of the preservation of its own defense. And I often say myself that, I'm not necessarily a pacifist, but I think sort of having those tools to say defend yourself, to sort of ensure that those hierarchies are not reinscribed is very different from sort of believing in a particular ideology of militarism and believing that security has to be aligned to militarism that then reinforces the sort of acquiring both the capabilities to acquire weapons, but also acquiring weapons in of themselves. And what we've sort of seen in the trajectory of the European Union is that this militarism as an ideology has very much been accepted as being fundamental to what security is. And that's why we kind of have a bit of an inconsistency here. Most people who know the history of the European Union will know that it has tended to champion the idea of human security. But now where we are in 2023 is a European Union that it also seems to really believe that security, including what it calls human security, is only guaranteed through through this attention to militarism and therefore increased militarization. This, of course, as you've already mentioned, is shaped by certain masculinities. But I also think it's important to emphasize that, masculinity as an idea is not just embodied in men, although of course it mostly is in the case of the European Union when we look at sort of who the leaders are. But it is also perpetrated by a lot of women who've sort of really fed into the system. And what we actually noticed in a lot of the discourses around feminism, as well as feminist foreign policy specifically, is that where the feminist prefix is linked to liberal feminism, there is an idea that feminism kind of slots really well with a militarization. I think at the end of the day, I think two things are important. One is to not simply assume that adopting feminism without knowing what kind of feminism it is going to sort of get rid of militarization or indeed get rid of that ideology that pushes militarization, which is militarism. I think the second thing is that when we're thinking about the increase in militarization in the European context, it's not just enough to sort of look at what are the security issues at stake, or rather, perhaps more precisely, what are the security issues that European actors are saying are at stake, but to look at who this militarization, including the one that slots in feminism, is being enacted against, right? So we need to think about those people on the boats who are prevented from finding shelter in safe spaces. We need to think about the African countries whose arrangements around free movements within their own region is being curtailed because migration is seen as a threat to the European Union. even while sponsoring different gender programs and claiming feminist foreign policy. And we certainly see this in the practices of Spain and as well as to an extent France and to more limited extent Germany in West Africa. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. I think this links perfectly to the next question for Ines. So you touched upon, or you mentioned human security and also, people on the boats. So human security requires putting the human rights also of marginalized and vulnerable groups at the center. So what steps do you think, Ines, the EU should take to achieve this transition, particularly concerning also migration at the borders, also from the Spanish perspective?
I would really start by saying, what should we not replicate from Spain? And I think it has a lot to do with what Tony was already starting to say. So I think that Spain has really started to place more importance toward the Sahel as one of the key regions of their foreign policy, because especially the issue of migration. And as you may know, there are two cities in North Africa that are from Spain that also have a lot of related to colonialism and some of the Spanish presence in the continent. And those two cities, so Ceuta and Melilla, are surrounded by fences, by wire walls, but they are still one of the entry points of migrants from the continent in Spain and then also in the European Union. And last year we saw the tragedy of more than 2,000 migrants trying to jump and cross those fences. And there are significant deaths. We don't know the number because actually the Spanish government and the Moroccan authorities have avoid to do a real investigation on the issue. And the response of the Spanish government was mainly to point out how this was the fault of human trafficking groups. And I think that this is interesting because actually in one of the thematicals, like the themes that Spanish feminist foreign policy is focusing on is on eradicating human trafficking, which is kind of also, I think, conflicting. But they were kind of blaming others rather than really pointing out their responsibility to protect those migrants and to fulfill their responsibilities towards human rights. And this has prompted a response that is asking for more strengthening of borders, to collaborate with governments in the Sahel and North Africa, but through the externalization of border control. It's like we are really not trying to promote some types of safe passing for migrants, but we are just delegating the responsibilities toward others through condition. We give them conditionalities. So it's, do you need some type of international development aid? Okay, but the condition is that you have to help us to restrict the crossing of migrants toward your country. And this has been accompanied by the creation of narrative, as Tony was saying, that migration is a threat. And in Spain, we use it like as a threat to the territorial integrity. And I think that this is kind of like high works of what our president is saying. And those narratives, they're really similar on some extreme right groups in our country, like Vox. And what we have seen is that there's a politicization of migrations. We have seen an increase of xenophobia, racism, and also like these demands on the state to fulfill the traditional role as a protector of national borders, even if that means that it's at the expense of other international commitments. So how do we change this approach? And obviously, I mean, migration studies is not really my expertise, but I'll do my best to answer it. And I think that first, as Tony and Deborah were also saying, it's to rethink the position on privileges, on how foreign policy and its elites are built on racist, colonial, patriarchal, androcentric, LGBT-phobic approaches. And obviously this is going to be very complicated because there's going to be resistance, and there is some actors that may have those privileges that they are not open to change, and they're really being, I mean, they have significant benefits from continuing to uphold bellicose and masculinized narrative. So even if this is a really like utopic thing, I think that one of the things that we can start by doing, it's really to create meaningful participatory processes. And that means that different types of actors need to be part of decision-making processes. And this includes civil society, it includes diasporas, and also beneficiaries of these policies. And obviously this means also doing a whole reconceptualization of how policy is made from a top-down approach, which is what we are currently seeing, towards a bottom-up that are less state-centric, and there need obviously more resources. And I think that this is also one of the challenges, because for example in Spain, when they were creating this feminist foreign policy, there were some significant dialogues with groups from NGOs and civil society groups, but none of their proposals were included in the guide. And that's where it needs to be really meaningful and not tokenized processes. And obviously, like the third element would be to accept the reality that migration is going to continue. We have pull factors that are going to stay here, and we need to really establish safe routes for migration, and not only based on instrumental approaches of we need more labor. For example, in Spain, we are really dependent on migrant labor for the agricultural process. So we need to see that migration is not only something that we need, but something that it's valuable per se, and that we need to protect. And this has to go ending this type of conditionality of selling arms to these governments that also are the ones that are exercising violence during the migration routes in Africa, and also strengthen current international protection regimes. And when I think, for example, in the Women, Peace and Security agenda, which has some elements of peace building that are non-military, we're seeing that prevention, for example, is completely put aside. And this is an article that Laura Shepher has published recently. And trying to put some distance on the military approaches of some existing agendas, this is key. And this is something that, as I said, I'm not an expert on migration, but I have a team in my institution in CIDAP who is amazing. And Blanca Garces, she often says that Europe should stop overreacting to migration and to stop fearing the fact that it's going to be a new migration crisis. And I think that Ukraine has shown how there's exceptional responses, and we have seen how the EU has opened its arms to millions of migrants and not thousands of it that we have seen with Afghans or Syrians. And this, at the end, it starts by changing how we create narrative about migration, and especially this type of, in the recent years, we're seeing how migration is becoming kind of a hybrid threat from the European point of view, and this needs to stop. Because if we continue just creating this type of securitizing narrative, the response that we are only provoking is abandoning our own core values and reducing the rights not only of those migrants that are in transit, but also those that arrive in Europe.
Thank you very much. Initially, I had another open question for all of you, but I think you covered most of it already. That was how will the EU's interpretation of security as an international actor affect groups of people differently? I think you said a lot about this already. So let's take it to another topic, which is also one of the fields of expertise of you, Ines. I hope. I will just pose the question to you. Moving to another pressing issue, which is like China's emerging threat in collaboration with Russia. it poses also a significant challenge for the EU. What are your thoughts on this issue, which is completely different to the one before, and how can the EU address these challenges effectively? Maybe is there a solution linked to FFP? What do you think?
So I think that the EU position towards China right now, it's very interesting. It's really in a process of deciding how to really engage with the country. And at the moment, we see that feminist foreign policy is completely off the table, or any approach that really tries to discuss things of gender equality. It's only linked on human rights, but for very specific minorities, and not that really show the complexity of China. And at the end, what we are seeing is that realpolitik, it's the preferred approach from the European Union to deal with China. And actually, I had the opportunity to see Toni in Barcelona recently, and after hearing her, there was an element that kept going into my mind, and is that China used to be colonized by Westerners. And sometimes we could see how the EU can adopt some patronizing situations or comments, but this is not the case. And what we are seeing is that really now the EU is just focusing on this equal approach. So we see that China is seen as in a hierarchical way position that it's different from what it used to be before. And the important thing is that China is now one of the states who is promoting some type of really traditional views of family in international fora. And this is something that the fact that the EU and its member states are not taken into account, for me, it's really interesting, because obviously we have seen that China is really positioning itself to try to avoid doing some progresses in the women, peace and security agenda, or other progressive agreements in the UN fora. But if we look at how the current situation is and the current relation is being managed, I think that competition, it still now the current dynamic. And if the EU really wants to go forward with this type of relation, I think that one of the things that we can introduce from feminist foreign policy, but being critical with what Toni has already been saying, is that if you really want to compete with China in the global south or in the narrative of the rest of the world, you need to start hearing them. You need to start doing foreign policy with them and not towards them. And I think that this starts by seeing the rest of the world not as an arena of competition, but rather as real equals, where you need to hear them and show real worries and understanding towards them. And I think that this is a position that at the moment it's completely unseen. And there's another part that it's besides competition, we have to agree that working with China, with all the global challenges that we're facing, it's a must. And we need to keep dialoguing with China. But that goes through the fact that China is not only the Chinese Communist Party. And I mean, we are talking with a country that is so extensive, with so many different actors that can help us to find other partners that go beyond the government to really cooperate in achieving human security in issues like how we reply to climate change, how we can regulate some tech the challenges that are now arising. And this may be not possible with the government, but there are other actors and there are other collectives that might be interested on cooperating. And finally, another thing that I wanted to point out is and I think that I'm talking a lot about this, but it's the fact of narrative and how we really can articulate a relationship with China. And I want to point out of how US and China relations are going out, and how this confrontational approach is it's bringing a lot of anti-Asian hate. It's bringing suffering and violence towards migrant and Asian American collective. And I think that we should, in Europe, try to avoid that. I mean, even if we are doing some type of competition, even if it's not the preferred way of managing maybe some relations, we need to be sure that this does not affect at the end the people who are not always supporting of their government. And I think that this also brings the fact that we need to have also a little bit of hope. And there are a lot of young people here in Europe, but also in the country, in China, who are working towards trying to change things. Maybe not how the government works, but yes, on things that are related to policies and how are their own security being made. And I think that one of the things about feminism is that not trying to impose how we think that things should be done, at least to those young people who are trying to organize themselves in feminist groups, trying to find strategies that promote sustainable development, who fight against pollution. And this is something that we need to allow their agency, encourage them at their own pace, and to just hope that this will bring some changes that will be decided by their own.
Great. I think that's very obvious that security and feminism and also the China relations are all topics that are also potential topics for a whole discussion, each and every topic in itself. So with looking at the time, I would also go to the next question and guiding it a bit more towards the future. So as we slowly conclude our discussion, I would like to ask you, Deborah, about the future of French diplomacy. How do you think it can be more inclusive in its approach to security and to promote FFP globally?
First, to be more inclusive, I think the definition of the French FFP must have a complete vision of women and their needs without seeing them as a homogeneous group, and the notion of intersectional feminism should be at the root of the feminist foreign policy. And this is a recommendation the Gender and Geopolitics Institute developed in its latest report published earlier this week on feminist foreign policy and how to achieve sustainable development goals. And it is, I think, in the French feminist foreign policy interest to officially defend intersectionality and post-colonialism. I think anything is possible. I will join Ines. There is hope because the government is currently drafting this definition, and we and other feminist organizations had many discussions with them. There is a growing awareness on the matter and the importance to develop a new vision of feminism and how to take actions in other countries. And I think France's Foreign Affairs Ministry is aware its conception of feminist foreign policy must evolve to increase its impact and its sensitivity to the evolutions of our time. Another way for French feminist foreign policy to become more inclusive is women representation. And on this matter, France needs more women in the spheres of political decision-making and in its embassies. And French FFP will be more effective with proper training on gender mainstreaming and more discussions between the different ministries in order to include a gender approach in every topic, such as environment, economics, trade, health, defense, etc. And finally, the embassies needs to receive regular training on women's rights and gender mainstreaming in the country where they work, what feminist foreign policy stands for, how to apply it, and it is important they use their role to take action with the local civic societies and administrations to build solutions with them. And it is by working hand in hand with the civil societies and feminist NGOs that the French feminist foreign policy will become more inclusive and will be able to adapt its programs for them to be more efficient and bring concrete changes.
Thank you. Now getting to another direction, or maybe another topic for talking about the future. It seems like to achieve a more sustainable and peaceful future and with true gender equality, also to promote FFP, we need to avoid the reproduction of Eurocentric cisgender feminisms in the perception of the security of in the EU. So, Tony, how do you suggest the EU avoid exacerbating it and develop a more inclusive and intersectional approach to security?
I think we already have some of the tools to begin to deal with that. So, for example, the European Union has the Gender Action Plan, which is supposed to govern its external relations. In the text of that, intersectionality is quite distinct. And a lot of the debates that have gone on in the European Parliament around especially development cooperation, there's been a lot of engagement around that. And we certainly see that in the German approach as well as the Spanish approach. So I think discursively, we have the tools. There are certainly people, particularly people within civil society, who fed into these processes, who've been quite articulate about how security has to mean caring, and really caring, you know. So I really believe in a sort of feminist ethics of care as being the sort of motivator for action. What that means, you know, fortunately, I would say from my perspective, but perhaps unfortunately for those who are so stuck in their ways, is that we do need to, you know, the first step is to sort of be a bit more humble, I guess, about being within the international system. It sounds like a very easy thing to, you know, just do. You can tell your friend, be humble, and everything will be okay. And in a way, I think that that would be a really good first step. I'll go back to something Inez said earlier, which was about sort of thinking about China. For years and years, the EU's approach to China was either, especially China and Africa, it's not a big deal. We're the top dogs here. And then it became, oh man, it's a really big deal. So the way that we engage with Africa is by looking at China. This is not the way to do foreign policy. This is not a good way for inclusive foreign policy. It is true that the European Union does have to maintain relations with China. After all, China is a member of the Security Council. It is an important power within the international system, even when that sort of engagement, I think, necessarily also has to come with substantive critiques because of China's behavior within the international system. And I think the European Union understands that. But that is not to suggest that then that in dealing with China in that way, all engagements with African countries, all 54 of them, has to be done through the prism of China in Africa. And increasingly, we're seeing this where you have folks who are really committed to some of those feminist principles that we've discussed, really seeking to enact them, particularly within development cooperation, thinking through, for example, representation of women in diplomatic positions within the EU delegations. And among some of those women, you even have feminists. So you sort of have those sort of commitments. But when it comes to sort of the practicality, you know, what is it that we're actually funding, and what is it that is motivating us to fund it? How are we organizing our funding cycle? It's still very much being dictated by the actions of other folks within Africa. To use another example, Russia is a problem, according to the European Union. And actually, in this regard, I very much agree with the European Union, actually, both in general right now for obvious reasons, but also for very obvious reasons in Africa. I would say Russia is a big problem. But that's not to suggest that the EU is necessarily a better option. So if we look at the case of Mali, where, you know, France was more recently, as well as Germany, unceremoniously kicked out, you've now got Russia. To a discerning person, you might say that actually it was the European Union that left that vacuum for Russia to fill out. I don't necessarily think that we can think of this as a blame game, right? Because we need to give Malians their own agency about choosing what sorts of partners they want. But at the same time, I think it's really important that in the same way that we're critiquing Russia, particularly Russia as an imperial aggressor in a space like Ukraine, which means that honestly, I don't actually have any high hopes for what it is that Russia might be doing in Mali. We cannot forget the role of European actors in that particular space as well. Okay. And I think that some level of self-reflection when it comes to security engagements around the world would be an important first step. And that self-reflection, in order for the sort of intersectional promise to be realized, will, to my mind, discover that a lot of the European Union's engagement and European actors' engagements with other places, subaltern spaces, has tended to be couched in certain levels of Eurocentrism, outright racism, a sense of superiority against some of those other countries. It might be, of course, that there are certain things that we perhaps do better here in Europe, and I say Europe deliberately here, not just the European Union. That might very well be true. But I think it's also appropriate and humble to perhaps give space for locally evolved and locally developed practices. That might, for example, suggest that there are more peaceable means to security than simply militarization. So if we sort of look at community level, at feminists at community level, who've been doing mediation, who've been engaged in those things that the European Union, as well as other European actors, think is very important, like participation, women's inclusion in different spaces. They've been doing it. Can we learn from them, as opposed to we're going to take this over there and then this is the best way to do, I don't know, democracy, for example. So I think, it sounds very simple and very idealistic. A bit of humility, I would say, is the first would be the first thing, but actually also just maybe making use of the tools that we already have, right? I don't need anyone at this juncture to define even more feminist foreign policies if that's not what we're about yet. But we do have tools at our disposal within the European Union that sort of govern what I would consider to be good practices for how we engage with others in the realm of security.
Thank you so much. I think I would have so many more questions to ask, but as time is running, maybe enough from my side until here. As we approach the end of our panel discussion, I want to give room also for the audience and some questions from the audience. So if you have not done so, please ask your question in the chat. We have a limited amount of time, so we kindly ask you to ask a question on the point and be as concise as possible. Paula and Beatrice, have you collected some questions already?
Yeah, we have already some questions. So the first one is from Chantal Elizabeth Jorge. She is a master's student, and she went in depth in matters of organized crime, terrorism and corruption. So she asks if feminist foreign policy strives to demolish patriarchal and hierarchical discriminatory structures globally. How can a FFP agenda help in the global fight against public sector corruption? And also, what is the potential of the different national agendas presented here could have in that context? So who would like to go first? Could go ahead.
I'm just wondering, since we don't have that much time, is it possible to take more questions and then go on to answer? Because I'm keen to be able to answer as many questions as possible.
Yeah, that's fine. Then I have a second question here from Federico. He says, in October 2022, the draft resolution from
rhetoric to reality, a global call for concrete action, racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance was adopted, even though countries like France, Germany, Netherlands, and Poland voted against it. Has this position been explained, or how can FFP from these countries propose real solutions to patriarchal dynamics of society when other dimensions of discrimination against migrant and racialized women are being banned from discussion? Then I have another question from Maria Irene. She asks if it is possible to know more about, in that case, Professor Castro's vision of China and EU relations, as Dr. Arco talked about. And then I'm just saying to you all that Deborah will be only joining us in 5 more minutes because she has to leave. And that's so far all we have. Thank you. Who wants to go first?
Yes, just sorry, I have to go. So thank you very much for the invitation. It was a pleasure to meet you, Ines and Tony, and I hope we can continue the conversation another time. Thank you. Good evening.
Thank you very much, Deborah.
I'm happy to go very quickly, although I didn't hear the second question fully. I'll try to circle back. So the first question was around can FFP tackle public sector corruption? I mean, I think in theory, yes. The problem, I would say, I mean, can I just say that's a really fantastic question. So one of the challenges that we've had with FFP is that it tends to be externally facing, right? Because it's foreign policy. That's what foreign policy usually is. But I would argue that once you put feminism in front of that, then you have to think about foreign policy differently. It's very difficult to advocate for feminism outside when you don't practice feminism internally. But of course, the assumption is that when a lot of these countries declare feminist foreign policy, there's always a sense of, hey, we got it right already, so it's now time to do it externally, which, as we all know, this is not the situation. So I think feminist foreign policy, yes, in principle it can, because corruption is the very opposite of caring, right? We know that corruption and the sort of broader impacts of it tends to affect those who are minoritized and marginalized already in society. So that's women, that's LGBTQIA people. But if I sort of look at my 2 continents of focus, corruption is a big issue. But of course, in our popular discourses, when you hear corruption, you hear Africa, you hear the Middle East or the Gulf, right? Or the, other places. Europe, we seem to have dealt with corruption. And I can assure you, as somebody who is here in the UK, so not necessarily in the European Union, but certainly in Europe, I can give you loads and loads and loads of examples of how corruption continues to affect things like, allocation of resources, which of course then impacts things like how gender-based violence is prosecuted, for example. So corruption, I guess the first thing to say is it's not just an issue of over there, it's certainly our own issue as well. Once we start to integrate feminist practices within what it is that we do, both legally, socially, and practically, then yes, it should really seek to tackle that. But remember that I sort of said that a lot of feminist foreign policy countries, they've not really been willing to sort of give up that power, their position in the hierarchy, which to my mind is kind of what allows corruption to persist. Recently, the term of the World Bank president was not renewed. You might not know this, but since the World Bank and the IMF was created, it has always been the case that the head of the World Bank is an American, so from the United States specifically, and the head of the IMF is a European. Despite the fact that most of those who the World Bank attends to are people that are not obviously from the United States. And the argument has been, well, it should be them because they're the largest shareholders, which kind of reinforces the point. I'm not arguing that they shouldn't be I don't think they should be, but we can leave that point aside that, they're the largest shareholders and therefore they're the leads. But the point is that in this way, in the different practices, very corrupt practices of international development, we see this hierarchies persist, which is why I think, I tend to be a bit skeptical about some of the application of feminist foreign policy. And perhaps to the third question around China and the EU, I don't really have a vision of China and the EU's relationship. The one thing I know is that, if more countries and more international organizations and more political entities within the international system cooperate, then there's less likelihood to be insecurity. Now, there are different reasons for why these different entities might not want to cooperate, which I accept. But I certainly think that, the fact that recently President Macron has said, well, I will actually go to China to have a discussion about Ukraine, has been seen by some as, why would he even bother to do that? And my question is, why is it taking this long for any European leader to do that? Even when trade wars were declared between the US and China, there was a realization that you have to engage with China, regardless of whether we like it or not. China is a member of the UN Security Council, right? Where the United States, Britain, and France also are. So they do have a certain status in this national system. In an ideal world, this status wouldn't matter at all, but it does. And if it does, where there is certainly a seat of power, then we need to engage with them as if they're an equal, as if their opinion matters in the broader discourses of international politics. So if I was to think where China and EU relations going, I would say, this is a start. I'm not a China expert at all, but this is the hope. Everyone else has talked about hope. This is one area where I'm hopeful about. I'll let the others go ahead.
I'm sure, Ines, there's something you would like to add to.
I think that Tony said everything really clearly, especially how when you start looking international politics with feminist lenses, I think it's something that most feminists in IR have said. You have to problematize how there's this separation between foreign policy and domestic politics. And I think that Tony's contribution to that, it's really clear. And I see that the second question that was about racism and xenophobia, I think that's something that has been repeated along the conversation, and it's that there are some positions and some privileges that some countries may not be willing to let go. And because obviously that means doing a work of self-reflection, of criticize themselves and their own positions and their own privileges and their own policies, which they are not willing to do. And I think that this is just an example of how many contradictions and how feminist foreign policy is still being implemented in silos. So there is not a comprehensive and really integral view of feminism, or on the other side, it would be that feminism for these countries, it's only liberal, and it's an approach that it's basically adding woman and steer, and it's not a real change. And I think that this is one of the key elements. And for example, this is just an anecdote. This Saturday, there was a feminist conference in Madrid, and there was a panel on how feminists should be anti-racist. And it was a lot of migrant organized groups here in Spain asking about their participation, how to reform politics, how to point out how many white feminists sometimes we forget about some issues of those collective, and we are not really hearing them or including them or taking them into account. And I think that the fact that we are still having these panels where they have to still reclaim some floor, it's just an example of how many countries and many states and many organizations also have failed to be critical and to stop giving up some privilege that we have. And I see another question here on the concept of woman and gender in foreign policy that we didn't reply. I think that at the end it's about hope. And I mean, youth, I think that every time we are more critical, we have so many lessons from history that we can learn. And we have so many really good insights on feminism, on adult-centric approaches, on militarism. And I think that this is about, there are two types, I mean, from responses. There's one that it's direct action, and it's engaging on international politics, as for example, Fridays for Future. So it's youth people also taking the streets, young people being part of peace building processes in their communities. And there's a second one that it's being part of the institutions and trying to change them from inside. And I think that's something that feminism is trying to do, that it's mixing this type of direct action with a more parliamentary and institutional approach. And I think that's something that we need to keep in mind, that both actions needs to be together to really bring some change. Thank you.
Thank you a lot. So I'm looking at the time. Oh, my light is turning off again. As we wrap up this panel discussion, I would suggest that we hear your final thoughts on how feminist foreign policy should impact the security of the EU. I think you touched upon some aspects already. I heard like being humble and hope, but maybe you could just bring it on the point. What is your vision for the future of FFP, and how can it be used to create a more peaceful and sustainable world? Please, if you could keep it short, maybe in one sentence or not more than 1 minute, to wrap up the discussion for tonight. Whoever wants to start, go first.
I think that it's just thinking that we are starting to do baby steps toward a good end. And this is something that I even say to myself in my daily life. And it's like the next step is the most important. So now we are trying to keep the conversation going. Now we have to identify best practices. Now we have to implement them. So we have to do step by step. And I think that there are many good propositions. And I think that the next one is really to be yourself heard and to really convince those that are maybe resistant to introduce these changes.
I think I guess the one thing I would say is that often when we talk about a policy, we talk about it as this finished product. And I want us to sort of think about feminist foreign policy as potentially a journey. It's the only way for me that I would say I've been able to make sense of feminist foreign policy, because I'm skeptical of the idea of foreign policy being feminist. Foreign policy itself reinforces the state system. And I believe that emancipatory feminisms wants to get rid of that. So in a way, we kind of have this oxymoron of feminist foreign policy. And at the same time, the things that are being proposed by feminist foreign policy are very important, precisely as Ines just said. And so I think really important for us to not see feminist foreign policies and their different types as just one thing. And I've been quite resistant to a singular definition, and perhaps I think it's more useful to think of it as a framework for acting a certain way within the international system, or in a way that sort of links the domestic and the international, and sort of think about it as a journey rather than a finished product or a destination. After all, feminism is still the only is still the only ism that seeks to get rid of itself. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I think this is a very great final statement for the very interesting conversation and discussion we had tonight. So thank you very much for each and everyone who took part in our event tonight. Thank you very much for being interested in the topic, for the attendance, and for the intriguing questions also at the end. I'm sure there could be so many more questions. Maybe we can gather again another time to talk about further questions. We look forward to meeting you again, and maybe in other circumstances to continue. where we are going to leave the discussion tonight. Thank you so much for bearing with us also a bit longer than expected. So yes, I think we can stop the event for now here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure.